Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar where we're discussing issues related to greenhouse gas emissions in the South African fruit export industry. My name is Simbasibanda. I'm with FANAPAN. I'm going to be facilitating this meeting, and you might have seen communication which had a different chair, but Mr. Bonani Nyondo from NMC, who is our co-convener of this webinar, is had to attend to some urgent business. So I'm happy to be facilitating this meeting this afternoon. And just by way of this subject, I think we are all aware of the climate change challenges, and of course, the export fruit industry is no exception. And this topic is coming at the, webinar is coming at the right time, especially as we are preparing for COP27, where, climate change issues are again on the global agenda for this month. And of course, this time around, COP27 is happening in Africa, in Egypt. And when we're talking climate change and in relation to the export fruit industry, is in common with all agriculture products, I think the world and the consumers more and more are demanding to know the carbon footprint of the food that they consume. And it gets even more critical when that food is having to cross borders. And so it's important that the value chain actors in the fruit industry are provided with the tools that they can use to estimate their carbon footprint, which will also be used as marketing information, but not only just for marketing, but also as responsible producers and exporters. We need to know that our carbon footprint is not making things worse than they are already. So we're going to be discussing, a framework which the various actors in this industry can use to map the carbon footprint of wherever they may be on this value chain. So without further ado, so we've got speakers that are going to lead us through this fairly complex subject. And what I'm going to do now is to ask Dr. Theo Diega. I hope he's online. I've been trying to check there if he's on. Kanto, can you confirm if the Dr. Theo is online?
Prof, he's having issue joining, but he's joining. So yeah, he's not here yet. Oh, yeah. He's here. He's here. Yeah. Just
okay.
On time.
Thank you very much. And before I hand over to Dr. Theo Diega, Dr. Diega is the chairperson of FANAPAN, the Food, Agriculture, Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network. We are co-hosting this webinar, co-convening it with the National Agricultural Marketing Council of South Africa, also with Stellenbosch Department of Industrial Engineering. And of course, we're going to be asking our chair, Dr. Theo Diega, to give us some opening remarks, and before we go to our main presentation. Dr. Theo, if you are ready, please, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone who took some time off today to join our webinar. It's an extremely important webinar for us as we are in the full finals on the way to COP. Some of us will already be leaving on Friday, others on Saturday. But for the next 2 weeks, we will be tied up in all the deliberations around negotiations on the rules and regulations on mitigation or adaptation to climate change in Sharm el-Sheikh this year. I've been involved in this process since 2011. I can very well remember in those first 5 years up to 2015, how hard we worked in organized agriculture just to have agriculture mentioned in a climate agreement. Originally, while these negotiations were still taking place under the banner and within the framework of the Kyoto Protocol, there was nothing about agriculture in that protocol. There was nothing in the discussions. When the parties met, agriculture was not on the agenda. So we were hoping to have agriculture be given a special framework, especially on the adaptation side, but also with mitigation co-benefits in the Paris Agreement. And after Paris, we were a little disappointed. We felt that food and agriculture is not specifically mentioned. It is just touched upon as if in the bypass. And then all of a sudden, since 2017, all hell broke loose and agriculture got very much mainstreamed in the debates on emissions, on methane, on the livestock industry, but also in the cropping and the fruit industries. In all these years, in all these COPs, and also in the substas, the meetings in May every year in preparation for COP, I have not really seen anybody dissecting the nuts and bolts of emissions. Until earlier this year, we ran in Stellenbosch into a student who was actually busy with his master's degree and then got it upgraded to a doctorate. Martin, who will be presenting his research to us today, who really went about to measure. In his research, he asked the question, so exactly how much is emitted from the farm gate to the export destinations in the fruit industry? And where is it emitted? At what phase? And given what kind of logistics, even up to the size of a truck carrying the fruits to the harbor, exactly what is emitted? Now, why this is so important for us? As three reasons. First of all, if as farmers and as practitioners in the food system, if we do not base our policies on science, our solutions will not be sustainable. Secondly, the science has been developed here on our home field at an African university on the African continent. Thirdly, if we know exactly what is emitted, we can manage it. It is just like we go about our business on any of our farms, no matter where in Africa and what the scale of our enterprises are. We all abide by the same rules. What you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So it becomes manageable once we have measured it. Now, although Martin came up with some brilliant answers to the questions exactly what has been emitted or what is being emitted from the farm gate to the export destination, the next question would be, so how much of the carbon is being sequestrated on the other side of the fence? You see, in agriculture, we are in this unique position that we work on both sides of the balance sheet. Every other sector of the economy can only be judged by how much greenhouse gas they emit. But we can also measure how much we sequestrate. In agriculture, we are in the business of sequestrating carbon, mostly emitted by other sectors, but also in our own. Because ultimately, the question would be, so can we sequestrate more than what is emitted elsewhere in the value chain? Or to put it in different terms, is it possible for farmers in Africa, in our value chains, to commit to net zero? can we get the balance sheet to come to a net zero, or even beyond that? Well, it is only possible to calculate that once we can measure in the same way in which Martin has now designed the tools to measure in the downstream value chain. And this is really the exciting part of the debate. It is once the practitioners and the scientists meet. Of course, Martin is a student of engineering. He originally set sail on his research as a master's student in engineering. But in the course of his research, his mentors, his examiners, thought it fit also to involve external examiners from other faculties at the University of Stellenbosch, and one of those comes from the Faculty of Mathematics, because it's important that the numbers bring integrity to the science. There should be no room for questions on the numbers, and a lot of that is in the maths, and this makes it all the more unique. Hence, in the run-up now to COP27, in our partnership with NAMC, Vanderpan, the farmers' organizations, the agribusinesses, it is really important for us to bring brand new science, which is not only solutions-based, but which also brings answers to the table. We don't go to COP with empty hands. And therefore, we are so grateful for all of you who take part in this webinar today, whether you are from agribusiness and whether you are from organized agriculture or in the policy space as we are in Vanderpan, or working elsewhere in our food systems. At the end, the solution will never only be on the farm or only be in the downstream value chain or even in the upstream value chain. The solutions will be tailor-made for the food system as a whole. Because the question on our footprint on climate or biodiversity or nature will be posed to the food system as a whole. Thank you to TM Cheliti and his team in Vanderpan. Thank you to Martin for bringing your research so timelessly to the table. And thank you to all the participants. That from my side, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diega, for framing this subject for us. That serves me a lot in having to introduce the subject. And so what I need to do now is to introduce our main speaker, that is Martin du Plessis, who is a doctoral student, as we all heard, at Stellenbosch University's Department of Industrial Engineering. Martin's PhD developed this framework and the factors for the South African fruit export industry to determine the carbon footprint, as we've just heard, of fresh fruit distribution from packhouse to international ports of destination. So Martin has a keen interest in sustainable freight transportation, distribution systems, and micro and macro logistics. So you can see that Martin, of course, has been busy, completed his undergraduate studies in 2019, and has just submitted his PhD thesis for examination, although he has already published several papers out of his studies, as you'll see when he presents his study. So he's going to give us a talk on a framework for assessing greenhouse gas emissions from the export fruit industry. So without further ado, Martin, please, if you can take the floor and go
Thank
ahead
you,
and make your presentation.
Simba, for the introduction, and Dr. Diega for giving us a broader overview of this very important topic. So, yeah, just excuse, I'm sitting here in the dark a bit. We've had a thunderstorm in Stellenbosch, and I think our electricity supply has been disrupted, so we're running on generators. So, yeah, without further ado, let's quickly go to the slides. So, Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin du Plessis, and I'm a PhD student at Stellenbosch University. And I've had the wonderful privilege of conducting this research over the past 3 years. And it's a topic of great concern, not only for the fruit industry, but also for the entire logistics realm. This is a systems problem which no individual or stakeholder in the value chain or supply chain can answer easily. So, this topic focused specifically, or this research project focused specifically on the fruit export sector. And that is because each different industry's logistics is different from another. The textile industry is different from the dairy industry, and the dairy industry is different from the mining industry, and each different sector has unique logistical circumstances and conditions. And as you all are well aware, South Africa has some additional logistical problems and challenges. And this was the departure point for this project. So I was co-supervised by Prof. Berg van Eden and Prof. Lila Goedals-Gerber. And here's a summary in 30 minutes of 3 years of research. So a background about the South African fruit export sector. We are the biggest exporter of fresh fruit in the Southern Hemisphere. We are the second largest citrus exporter in the entire world. And for the 2020-21 season, we exported nearly 3.6 million tons of fresh fruit. And that equates to nearly 180,000 40-foot reefer containers. And the largest export market for this was the European Union, followed by Asia, Middle East, and United Kingdom. And then the remaining markets are also evolving. In terms of the type of projects that we export, the largest contributor is citrus fruit. Astounding 63%. We're all well aware of how big our citrus industry is and the challenges associated with it. Then followed by the plum industry, which is your apples and pears, followed by table grapes, and the remaining 3 categories, which is stone fruit, subtropical fruit, and berries. That represents a mere 5% of the total exports of South Africa. So, Prof. Alan McKinnon stated this problem quite brilliantly in his book, Decarbonizing Logistics, when he stated that climate change has evolved from being just another environmental problem to potentially the greatest threat facing our civilization. And this really gives ammunition for what we intend to do in this research project and the entire world to frame the question of this is not only a problem for a specific industry or in terms of the fruit export sector. This is a universal problem which we really need to address. So back to South African fruit export industry, there's a heightened awareness amongst all consumers that we have to do something about greenhouse gas emissions. And consumers are increasingly demanding visibility of value chain emissions. And the next thing which I think the European Union will possibly potentially do is they can introduce a carbon barrier to South African fruit exports or any fruit exports, like they've done with 26 categories of products already, which they intend to install a carbon barrier by 2026. So they are quite adamant that by 2026 for steel, for aluminium, for cement, those energy intensive products, there will be a carbon barrier on. So that excludes certain countries from exporting these products into the European Union. And the final thing is this research puts the South African fruit export industry on the forefront of fighting climate change and assessing the emissions. So this really puts us in a good perspective compared to other countries like Chile, Peru, Argentina, who are major competitors. So the problem, as Prof. de Jager mentioned, or Dr. de Jager mentioned, the scope of my research focused on from the point where the fruit is packed in its finished packaging for export up until the port of import. That entire chain of logistical activities from the door of a packaging facility to the country of import. That is the scope of my research. So whether the fruit is flown out or the fruit is exported via reefer container or conventional pallets, we need to calculate the emissions of any possible potential distribution scenario. And that's really quite a significant problem because no individual stakeholder, no fruit exporter, no logistics service provider has visibility of your entire value chain. They might potentially have visibility of how much emissions is emitted during the road transport leg from Muketsi to the port of Cape Town for Avos, but they have no visibility of what the emissions are for the deep sea leg where the container is transported to Rotterdam, or how much emissions is emitted to store the avocados in a facility in Cape Town, in a cold storage facility. So this is really a complex problem where we need to take this complex thing and simplify it by suggesting a method or a recipe that's easy to use for any stakeholder, while still retaining the accuracy of the results. So each different activity in your distribution chains emits emissions, and I'll elaborate a bit more about that later. But this is in broad the scope of the research that we've conducted. Okay, so summary of the problem is there is no carbon mapping framework. If you don't have a recipe, you don't know how to cook. That's the first problem. So we need to define a universal standard or a recipe that any stakeholder can use and apply to estimate the emissions of a specific distribution scenario between point A and point B, and for the refrigeration between point A and point B. So that's the first problem we have. And then the second major problem is, how do we know how to quantify these emissions? We've got a recipe, but we don't have any ingredients. So this is where my research, I think, also made a good contribution, is to use a specific transport mode. How much emissions is emitted to move a ton a kilometer, or to refrigerate a pallet of avocados in a cold storage facility? How much emissions is really emitted? Or to handle a container in a port of export? How much emissions is really emitted? So that is the two problems in a nutshell that we have in this realm. So this problem was confirmed by one of my published articles. I'll share the link afterwards. So yeah, this article just summarizes these two problems which I just discussed. So my solution to this complex problem is a recipe that contains all the ingredients which you need to quantify the emissions of a specific distribution scenario. So for a shipment of fresh fruit, whether it's table grapes, pome fruit, citrus, subtropical fruit, blueberries, you name the type of fruit, this framework was specifically developed for that types of fruit. So this 20-page document is a recipe that contains all the necessary factors, the ingredients to quantify the emissions. So let's dive a bit deeper into what the framework entails. The framework basically consists of 6 steps. The first step on your very left-hand side in the vertical plane says we first need to go and identify what is the chain of activities by which my fruit is exported. So on an individual shipment basis, let's say for table grapes, from the packaging facility in the Hex River Valley up until the port of import in Rotterdam or Southampton, wherever it may be, what is my chain of activities from A to B that I need to quantify the emissions for? That's my first step. The second step is for each of these emission generating activities, I need to perform steps 2 to 5. And we'll discuss more about that later. But it's really a systems problem which we try to visually portray here. So the first step, let's elaborate a bit more on that. Another published journal article that we conducted said, what is all the possible methods by which we can export the fruit? From point A to point B, what is all the potential scenarios? And this is really quite exhaustive, these diagrams. And each of these vertical columns represents an emission generating activity that the user needs to quantify. So, or quantify the emissions of. So there's 5 diagrams, and these 5 diagrams capture all the possible scenarios. So there's no way working around that the user neglects or omits certain activities, thereby minimizing or reducing the amount of emissions actually emitted. So the first step is then, just to recap, what is all the activities that we need to do a calculation for of each of those activities? The second step is for each of the activities that I identified in step 1, we now need to go and collect data. And the framework is quite prescriptive and in depth when it specifies what data is necessary. The first step is you need to go and collect the shipment weight. What is the gross weight of fruit that I'm moving? That includes the weight of the net weight of the fruit and the packaging. And it's important to include the weight of the packaging material, because in your entire distribution chain, about 5% of the emissions is directly due to the fruit packaging. So it's important to incorporate the packaging material into your weight calculation. The second thing is we need actual distances. And if you can't find the actual distance that a vehicle traveled, we suggest distances based on certain algorithms and tables and that type of stuff and so forth. The third step is in your distribution process from a packaging facility up until the port of import, a certain percentage of fruit is lost. So for avocados, one of the big exporters, they lose up to 5% of their fruit from the Dover packaging facility to the country of import. And that's really due to road accidents or temperature losses or supply chain disruptions or anything, or cold chain disruptions, anything that can lead to the fruit spoiling. So you start with 100 kilogram and you end with 95 kilograms of fruit, for argument's sake. We need to account for that losses, because that fruit that is lost is eventually going to be repooled into your distribution chain, because the consumer wants the fruit on the shelf. So we need to account for this as well. And the fourth step of data, or fourth recommendation in terms of what data needs to be collected, is where we specify to the user, collect the type of road transport vehicle. Was a container used or was a pallet used throughout the distribution process? How long was it stored in a cold storage facility? That type of critical information to ensure that the user selects the most accurate and the best emission intensity factor to quantify emissions. So something unique about the framework is 2 levels of knowledge is possible. The first one is for first-hand knowledge of the entire distribution process. So if the fruit exporter has export documentations of PPECB for each shipment, then that would be ideal. But if the user doesn't have that documentation, we recommend alternative weights, alternative distances. So the framework is multifaceted. Okay, that's step 2 of the framework. The third step of the framework is where we need to go and select an emission intensity factor. So we know what the activity is. We have the data of the activity. We now need to go and say, to move a ton a kilometer with this type of road transport vehicle emits this amount of emissions. Or if I store a pallet of fruit in a facility for this amount of days, I need to select this factor. So this third step is the most important step of the entire framework, actually, in terms of accuracy. So just a bit of more detail on that. As far as my knowledge is concerned, this is the first emission intensity factors for road transport vehicles in South Africa. And what this says to us, for different configurations of road transport vehicles, whether we transport pallets or containers, and the percentage empty running, so the vehicle runs empty 10% of the time or 45% of the time, and the vehicle is loaded this amount of this percentage of its capacity. To move a ton a kilometer, this is how much emissions we expect to be emitted. And this is really revolutionary, because even big logistics service providers are struggling to answer this simple question, where they need to answer how much emissions was emitted to move my cargo from this point to that point. So the right-hand article has been published yesterday. This article was done for a tanker company, and they had the systems problem which they couldn't answer. And we hopefully solved that for them. And the article on the left was also input to the table that we developed to suggest the emission intensity factors for different road configuration vehicles in South Africa that transport fruit. And we're looking forward to more collaboration with different LSPs next year, so we can expand this potentially to different sectors as well. We'll hopefully be able to do something like that. Then the other transportation modes, we modeled emission intensity factor for rail transportation of containers in South Africa. We're all aware that there's quite unique challenges in South Africa in terms of our rail infrastructure, but it was quite interesting to see the carbon benefit of using rail as transportation mode to move our containers. So when you compare it, the emission intensity of using rail, which is 31.5, versus different types of road transport vehicles, you see that the emissions are nearly 50% less. So there is the potential for huge carbon reduction if we do a modal shift. Then we also suggested some emission intensity factors for air transportation. Hopefully in the future we can develop these specifically for South Africa. And then on the right-hand side, factors for deep sea ocean transport, for container vessels, for different trade lanes of vessels. And then at the bottom, there's emission intensity factors for different configurations or for reefer vessels. And these vessels are the old conventional vessels where you physically load pallets of fruit into the cargo hold of the vessel, and then you distribute your pallets throughout. And as far as our knowledge is concerned, that is the first emission intensity factor globally for any refrigerated vessel. So these values are needed to quantify the emissions of transportation. And the accuracy of these values directly influence how accurate your emission calculation is to the real deal, the real emissions of the distribution scenario. Then something else that we also did was for the facilities that handle and store fresh fruit. They are split into two. Firstly, on your left-hand side, there's the facilities that store pallets of fruit. And this is your typical cold store, which handles and stores pallets of fruit. So we did a journal article about that as well. And as far as we're concerned, this is the first emission intensity factor for cold storage facilities. And this was really revolutionary because this answers the simple question that we couldn't find the answer for. To store a pallet of fruit for 1 day, how much emissions is really emitted per pallet? And it's also important to consider that if I store a pallet for a longer duration, that pallet is awarded more emissions than a pallet just simply moves through the facility. So these values are quite unique because they enable you to say that pallet is stored for a month and a half, while the other one is stored for 2 days. So the one that's stored for a month and a half is penalized more, is awarded more emissions than the one that's only stored for a day. So that's quite a unique contribution, I think, to quantify the emissions of these cold storage facilities. And then on the right-hand side, for the different types of facilities that handle and store containers. And it's also important to split here the emissions of these logistical facilities, because it's possible to move a container through a facility without storing it, while other containers are stored for 3, 4, 5 days even. So we need to split this and ensure that the emissions that we calculate is really a fair representation of what is actually emitted. So the fourth and fifth step is where we say, for each of these activities that has emitted greenhouse gases, we went and collected data of that specific activity. We selected an emission intensity factor, and now we do a simple multiplication sum, where we say this specific activity, whether it is road transport or cold storage or handling in a port, how much emissions were actually emitted during that activity. So that's step 4. Step 5 is where we say we divide the emissions that we calculated in step 4 amongst the fruit. So say, for example, this specific emission generating activity was road transport. To move 28 tons of avocados from Moketsi to a cold storage facility in Cape Town, in step 4, how much emissions were really emitted during that transport leg. And in step 5, we say each kilogram of fruit is responsible for XYZ kilograms of emissions. So that's step 4 and 5. And then step 6 is for each of those individual emission generating activities in your distribution chain, we just go and sum all the total emissions, or to get the total emissions. So summing all of them together results in moving fruit from point A to point B per kilogram of fruit. How much emissions were actually emitted? And this is quite important because the first step sets the blueprint, the foundation for the entire assessment, while each of the other individual activities assesses the emissions per activity. So that's the framework in 6 steps. The next question that I always get is, how was this framework developed? Was it thumbs-up? Was it a dream? Or how did I come about this framework? And this framework was, and the emission intensity factors, is the result of 3 years of extensive research, where we went and had a look at what is the literature solution to this, what does ISO standards tell us, what does the GHG framework suggest. So the best literature we used for this. In terms of observations, we need to ensure that this framework is a true representation of the logistical circumstances of the fruit export industry. Then the third input to the framework is the emission intensity factors. And those are the different factors that I just discussed now. To move a ton a kilometer, how much emissions is emitted? To store a pallet for a day, how much emissions is emitted? That's the emission intensity factors. Then on the right-hand side, the distribution chain diagrams, that's the first step in your entire framework, or in the framework, and that suggests the blueprint for the entire emission assessment. Then semi-structured interviews with subject matter experts were crucial throughout the process to ensure that this framework is usable and represents the best there is. So Prof. Alan McKinnon, Professor Toby Peters, journal reviewers, all of these people were involved continuously throughout this process. And then the other input to the framework was collaboration with industry. So fruit exporters, fruit representative bodies, all these people were involved in formulating how the framework looks. And the final input to the framework is to apply the framework iteratively to distribution scenarios, where we say, this is the scenario by which fruit is exported from point A to point B. Let's apply the framework and see if it can do that. In an iterative approach, you develop the framework until there's no more loopholes in your framework, until it covers the extent of the distribution process, where there's no confusion left. So this is the inputs to the framework. So the next question I always get is this really a problem? And the framework that we developed was applied to 7 different distribution scenarios for different fruit types, as indicated. And the results are quite different in terms of the type of fruit, the packaging configuration used, the type of transportation modes, the storage duration of the fruit. All these elements directly impact how much emissions is emitted per kilogram of fruit. So let's take the avocado one as an example. So just a bit of a background about the distribution process. Avos are packed in Muketsi, and they are loaded onto a refrigerated truck, 28 pallets, transported to a cold storage facility in Cape Town, stored for 7 days, then stuffed into reefer containers or packed into reefer containers. And this reefer container then spends 1 day in the port of export or port of Cape Town, and then it's shipped to the port of Rotterdam. So for that specific scenario, the pie diagram on the left-hand side is the results. And one can clearly see that the deep sea leg is responsible for a large proportion, but the remaining activities have a big or significant impact on my total emissions. So it's really important that we analyze all the activities, big or small. We can't neglect any of them without proof. So the result is, let me just move this quickly, to distribute 1 kilogram of fruit from Muketsi to the port of Rotterdam emits 630 grams of emissions. So I moved 1 kilogram of fruit halfway across the world. And to move that 1 kilogram of fruit emits 630 grams or 0.63 kilograms. And other types of fruit and transportation configurations and distribution chains potentially emit a lot more. Blueberries, for example, if they are flown out, they can emit per kilogram of fruit up to 12.3 kilograms of emissions. So our logistical decisions and the way we distribute our fruit really has a significant impact on the total emissions of our distribution chain. So future work, where are we heading next? The first thing which we are going to do is for various distribution scenarios, as I indicated in the world map for the different types of fruit, we're going to write a journal article about that to state what is the realistic emissions for various distribution processes. The second thing which we are going to do is we're going to attempt to estimate the total emissions of the South African fruit export sector for the distribution process. And this is based on AgriHub data and other data sets. So it will hopefully be an accurate representation of the total fruit export industry's emissions. The third step is, which I have a hunch about, South Africa has some problems in terms of reefer containers. So how does exporting fruit from an emission perspective in containers versus conventional export via pallets compare? Isn't it better to just export the fruit from a carbon perspective in terms of pallets throughout my distribution process? So that's another article that we're attempting to do or envisage to do. And yeah, we're open for collaboration or potentially other types of projects. So anyone in the audience, if you have any good suggestions for future research that we can potentially do, we are open for collaboration. And yeah, that is 3 years of research, a recipe, and emission intensity factors in a nutshell. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Over to you, Simba.
Thank you very much, Martin, for very interesting presentation, really, practical as well. So we're going to, I know that there are already a number of questions on the chat box, but I'm going to ask you to be, patient for a while. We're going to move on and ask a colleague who is an expert in the industry in terms of sustainability and business accountability in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. David Farrell, I don't know if you are on. David?
Yeah, I'm on. Thank you.
Thank you, David. David is from Blue North. I'm not going to attempt to introduce him. So David, if you can introduce yourself, especially your company and the kind of things you do, and then maybe give some reflections on what Martin has just presented and how this affects, the whole industry and how this can be extended also to, to other areas. I see that there's already a question that's saying, can we go, before the fruit is, you cover all those 6 steps. There is obviously the biological side of production. I'm not sure whether this is something Blue North deals with. But maybe you can just tell us and respond and give some reflections to this presentation. Over to you, David.
Simba, thank you. And Martin, congratulations on a tremendous body of work that I certainly concur with your opening remarks about the importance of this whole subject. It cuts to the heart of this industry that I think most of the people on this call are probably part of. It's an industry that is based on serving distant markets and requiring these complex value chains, logistical chains to reach. And it's almost taken for granted that that is just the way this industry is structured. And you highlighted the looming potential of barriers to access to markets related to carbon emissions, embodied emissions in supply chains that could become a really significant and severe barrier to entry to these markets that, as I said, we've taken for granted as part of the economics of these industries. So I think what you've contributed to is really unpacking the detail of that logistical chain and enabling what it looks like, certainly a systematic process to enable that calculation to be done in a robust and in a credible way. And importantly for that to then firstly demonstrate that this industry collectively, the South African fruit export industry is aware and on top of its game in terms of understanding its emissions. It's not just a vacuum or a blind spot It brings it fully into light, and importantly, the detail enables the right decision making. It was touched on earlier. The measurement enables the management decisions to be made. What I would like to say as well is just we work as a consulting business in the sector, and there is a history, to the credit of the fruit and the wine industry in South Africa, a history of really trying to grasp this nettle of emissions, and we've been in the fortunate position of being entrusted with the management of an industry project called Confronting Climate Change, which goes back to about 2008. It was set in motion to really start to understand what were the emissions across the supply chain, including the agricultural component or the fruit production component. And that work has culminated in what is, I think many of you may be aware of, as Confronting Climate Change, which endeavors to provide a robust and a credible basis for agribusinesses to calculate their emissions end to end, and to be able to demonstrate that this isn't a blind spot, to use it to reduce emissions and to move towards the achievement of science-based targets, net zero, what have you. It provides the measurement basis for that. And I can only hope, and that would certainly be our wish, is that this work can just contribute into that already, that established momentum in the fruit and the wine industry, that this can just add another notch to the belt of credibility, of robustness, of greater accuracy, more granular, more refined information that can really support this industry process, that finally, I would say is the value of that investment over 10 or so years by the industry bodies, is finally the value is really coming to the fore, and certainly that, as I said, would be our hope, that this can contribute to that already established base in these industries. But Martin, yeah, that would be some comments from my side, and just congratulations on what looks like a really tremendous piece of work, and a continuing piece of work, which is really exciting to see. The unpacking of different scenarios and doing those comparisons that are going to undoubtedly challenge some of the status quo in terms of just assumptions around modes of transport, modes of shipping product. So well done, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions from my side as well. And if there's anything further, Chair, if you'd like me to comment on, I'm happy to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for those comments to buttress Martin's presentation, and also to share briefly on some of the work you've been doing at Blue North. So we now open for questions from the floor. We already have a couple of questions on the chat, so please, you can indicate if you raise your hand, or if I'm able to see it, and you can pose your question. But while people are thinking of questions, let me just raise the questions that have come up on the chat already. So yeah, Martin, you can take some of these, and I think David, you can also jump in where you want to, supplement what Martin would have covered. The first question there says, Martin, this is really great. This is from Anel Jansen. The first question is, has your work extended to the biological production side of the value chain? I think David alluded to this briefly. So in other words, does this tool extend to cater for a specific crop, that is production practices, and against specific emission intensity factors? Can we carbon footprint a ton of soft citrus in a certain area? So this is looking at the production side before you start the logistics part of it. And another question related to that from Anel as well is, what is your view of the transition within the logistics chain to renewable powered trucks. So we'll take a few more so that you can be thinking of this and then respond to them in a batch. Another question or comment from Alistair Galloway. Thank you very much, Martin, for the interesting presentation, valuable research. For further upstream activities, the Sustainability Initiative of South Africa offers a digital record-keeping program where farms and packhouses can choose to have their carbon footprint calculated via a partnership with confronting climate change. The digital recording program is available both within South Africa and globally. To find out more, please feel free to follow the link. I think this is more to everyone. So if you can, follow that link if you need to read some more on this. And then also, we've got a question from Matthews Ngoza who says, what happens to unused portions on the farm? So this is again on the biological side, but also talking to food losses, unused portions on the farm. So if we're talking of fruit and you've got spoiled fruit, have you looked at quantifying emissions from these export product offcuts? These constitute a large part of waste on the farms. In other words, would this constitute the total carbon footprint? In other words, for a kilo that, Martin, your framework is calculating, there's also a certain portion, certain percentage, which is already been lost on the farm. Would it be possible to include this in estimating the total carbon footprint? So maybe I can give you a chance to respond to those two. Then I'll move on. Willem, if you can get ready, I'll move over to you as soon as Martin is done with the responses. Thank you. Martin.
Thank you, Prof. Simba. So the first question from Anel. Remember that the framework scope is only for logistical activities. So the question regarding specific crops and the production practices for specific areas is not included in the scope of my research. But as far as I recall, many moons ago, we had a presentation from Anel Blighnout from Blue North about the Confronting Climate Change carbon calculator, and that covers the scope of production. But I must mention that once again, the amount of emissions emitted for different production practices and different production methods is directly linked to the emission intensity factors that are available in literature or in industry for those specific activities. So significant work is unfortunately also needed in that sector to ensure that the factors that we use are indeed a true representation of how much emissions are actually emitted to cultivate different types of citrus in different production areas, or to use different types of input, different organic fertilizer versus inorganic fertilizers. That realm of research still has a lot of further work left to do before we can tick box it and say it's finished and done. So can we carbon footprint a ton of soft citrus in a certain area? The factors that are available currently don't allow us to do that, but my framework assesses for different production areas, transportation to and from those areas are included. So that's your question, Anel. I hope I sufficiently addressed your question. The second question that you have is transition to renewable power trucks or vehicles. And that is certainly a place where we can really reduce the carbon intensity or decarbonize our logistic realm quite significantly. We should just remember that there's stuff that are low-hanging fruits, and we should first focus on these low-hanging fruits. Little effort is required to decarbonize those industries or that specific part of a distribution chain quite quickly and easily. For example, your cold storage facility introducing solar panels, that's a low-hanging fruit. But for vehicles or to replace diesel vehicles with electric vehicles, that's going to be quite a challenge in South Africa because we don't have all the electrical infrastructure available for charging on the N1 or the N3. So that shift is going to be more difficult than it is to decarbonize certain sectors in your distribution chain. And I'm of the opinion that the easiest and the best way to decarbonize our export industry or logistics industry in South Africa is the logistical facilities, the ports, the cold storage facility. These facilities have the capacity and the capability, the technologies available to decarbonize them. But the maturity of the technology in South Africa for road transport vehicles, I think is a bit in the distant future. So electric vehicles, unfortunately, in South Africa, I think in the distant future, it will become a reality. But until then, we're going to continue to recharge electric vehicle with a diesel generator on the N1 near Carnarvon or in Beaufort West. So that's unfortunately the reality of electric vehicles in South Africa. The other question from Matthew, unused portions of the farm, quantify emissions of these products. Remember that whether you move 1 kilogram of export quality avocados or 1 kilogram of byproduct, you still move 1 kilogram of produce from A to B. So the emissions are going to be the same. The vehicle doesn't distinguish whether it's a kilogram of cola or a kilogram of export avocados or table grapes. So it's really, this research can be used for any type of, it's actually the blueprint for any type of commodity to estimate logistical emissions. Think of this as a container or a box. Whether it's a kilogram of fruit in the box or a kilogram of coal or iron or textiles or tin food, that is irrelevant for the transport or for the distribution chain if refrigeration is absent. So in terms of your question, I didn't focus specifically on unused portions on the farm. The loss that I account for is for export quality fruit. So the fruit that was destined for export, the first grade fruit, which is spoiled during the distribution process. So in the future, it would be interesting to see from the fruit tree to the shelf in a retail shop, what is your actual distribution emissions? And the United Nations estimated to be, it depends on the type of commodity once again, but they estimated to be anywhere between 15 and 30%. We have no visibility actually of what amount of produce, fresh produce that is really is discarded before the packaging of the fruit. So the entire distribution, actually the entire supply chain, we have very limited visibility of what really goes to waste or unused portions. So that is definitely something to divulge in the future, to assess really, instead of wasting these products, could we have actually reduced our emissions by finding alternative markets for these products, instead of dumping it in a landfill? So yeah, and then another question. Yeah, Prof. Simba, I think it's over to you again.
Yes, thank you, Martin. I don't know, David, whether you want to add anything to what Martin has just shared on those questions.
Maybe just the only thing that I would say, just with a confronting climate change hat on, is that we've gone the route of not trying to model particular farming practices, but rather to collect primary data. So the carbon emissions related to a farm or a pack house are related to actual, for example, liters of diesel used, liters of petrol, amount of pure N fertilizer, the agrochemical active ingredient, and so on. So we're trying to get to that level of detail that we're not just building assumptions on assumptions in terms of emissions factors. We still rely on emissions factors from a EcoInvent database, which is the international sort of standard on available emissions factors. But just to make that point clear. But thank you, Chair. That's it from my side.
Okay, thanks, David. So it's also, of course, important to make sure that I know that emission factors which are coming from the international literature fairly based on large quantities of data, but they are not actually in a sense, country specific. We've noted similar challenges in the livestock sector, for instance, that the IPCC values are default, but they use one factor, for instance, for the whole of Africa, which of course is unimaginable. So we obviously need local factors wherever we can. So it's important to collect that data. So Martin, you wanted to come back?
Yes, just another comment in terms of emission intensity factors for the activities before the fruit packaging begins. So that is for your production and your fruit packing and the types of cartons used as packaging material. Next year, we envisage to do a few final year industrial engineering projects where we collect data from industry from different packaging facilities where we want to answer a few simple questions. For example, to pack 1 kilogram of citrus fruit at this type of facility, how much emissions were actually emitted? So we want to do a few of those types of studies for different packaging facilities. The other one is for the long-term controlled atmosphere storage of pome fruit. To store that fruit long-term before packaging begins, how much emissions were actually emitted? For different types of packaging material, we want to, in discussions with a packaging manufacturer, to determine the carbon intensity of different types of packaging material. I'm using this 4.5 kilogram box. This box, how much emissions were emitted to manufacture this box? So for different activities, we want to extend this research or the scope of the research to include that type of stuff. So David, yeah, hopefully we can develop some factors that are a bit more accurate and better than international literature. And then something else which you mentioned, Prof. Simba, using international factors for this macro problem is detrimental because South Africa's energy sector is really unique. When we compare our grid electricity, how dirty it is, it's 3 times more dirty than any other country which you can even compare to. Our diesel fuel, we manufacture about 30% of our diesel fuel from coal through the Fischer-Tropsch method by a big South African fuel company. And the emission intensity of that fuel is quite higher, we believe. So how accurate are the international values? They're a good starting place in the absence of any specific values for South Africa. But hopefully in the years to come, we can develop a database or a bank of values specific for South Africa and African countries where we can set a standard and say European or North American values aren't the alpha and the omega in terms of quantifying our emissions. Over to you, Prof. Simba.
Thanks, Martin. Yes, let me turn over to Willem de Lang. Thank you for being patient. If you can please pose your question.
Martin, Willem de Lange speaking, Department of Agricultural Economics, Stellenbosch University. Martin, I just want to add to what you've just been saying. I think we all agree that we are custodians and we want to uphold the relative competitiveness of exports, South African exports in increasingly sophisticated markets or that serving sophisticated consumers, i.e. European markets. Immediately, I can see a very good application if we can, in the end, have a fully integrated framework or model that measures your footprinting right from the beginning, where on farm, even on input side, right through distribution, even on the retailer level and consumption level in the European market, to compare the South African value chain of a particular commodity with, say, and I'm thinking now specifically, I'm not sure why you've been mentioning citrus and avos, but I'm thinking of, for example, table grapes. We compete with table grapes being produced, for example, in Egypt, serving the same market, okay? The consumer will sit there and sit with a choice. Okay, I have Egypt table grapes, I have South African table grapes. Two totally different distribution chains, transport, even production associated with it. To enable, and I see I can see this work of yours is applicable towards measuring the complete, whatever we want to measure. We can limit it to carbon footprinting, but there are so many other variables that you can actually measure, but everybody is sticking to greenhouse gas emissions. We can start with that, that's not a problem. But to ensure fair and traceable comparability of those two boxes of cartons of table grapes in the same supermarket, say Aldi or Lidl or whatever the case might be, would be the cherry on the pie in the end. I think we all agree with that. Getting there is a long journey. Yes, we can assume certain levels of technology, certain levels of efficiency, and certain production practices up to the farm gate. Yes, we can assume what you've been doing, certain distribution practices. What we then need to do is we must define an endpoint. You've mentioned Rotterdam. Okay, that's fine. We can define the endpoint as being Rotterdam, or we can even go further. We need to delineate this animal very cleverly to showcase the competitiveness of South African produce in future. I'm not sure whether you must have read Lauren de Kock's thesis on the poem industry, where it doesn't, basically the GHG emissions lever on farm is like minutely small, and the elephant, or the ignored elephant in the corner, was that cold storage. Exactly what you've just said. So what's the solution there? It's a logistic solution. Get the apples as quickly as possible out of South Africa, let them store it in Europe, and voila, your carbon footprint of South African apples just plummets. So that's got nothing to do with how we produced apples, and it's got everything to do with transport. So this is a very complex, interlinked, integrated problem. And David, I've spoken to David a couple of times. Yeah, fine-tuning the figures is a good step forward. Yeah, I foresee that I'll drop by. I'll drop you an email. I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of pre-consumer, i.e. production, but also then we need to think maybe on, post-consumer side. What happens to the produce being after they've produced it, consumed it? Do they throw it away? Do they landfill it? What do they do with it? Yeah, that was just a side comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Willem. That's a fully sort of comprehensive question there. I'm not sure, Martin, whether it's for noting, or do you want to respond briefly to that? And maybe yes. Dr. Theo Diaga, you can also come in there if you wish. It's a fairly broad question, I think. It's really looking at philosophically and also in practical terms. I was going to have a rider to that question as well, to say, can we price products when we get to the consumer level, incorporating the carbon footprint, in which case it's not just logistics, but also what's happening on the farm. In other words, the consumer should pay the full price, because that's the full cost of producing, apart from the energy and transport and everything you put into it. Any comments? Anything to add?
So, Willem, that is a very, very good statement, few statements you make there. And the crux of the matter is, this is a systems problem where we need to answer this in a credible and accurate way if we want any form of comparison. And currently, we don't have the tools. We want to hit a nail into a wall, but we don't have a hammer. So my research hopefully develops a hammer for this logistical part of this problem. But we will definitely have to in future expand this to the point where we can say for a consumer, or place a sticker on a carton of table grapes, where we say this table grapes per kilogram of fruit emitted this amount of emissions for the entire value chain, from preparing the soil for planting, to the annual management of the vineyards, to the packaging, to the type of packaging used to package the fruit in, the cold storage, everything needs to be included. And this is really a systems problem, which we are only beginning to analyze now. So expanding the scope and doing everything at once is a bit difficult, but I think after this exercise, we can most probably continue working in the logistical sector and developing newer factors. But I think in terms of logistics emissions, this covers that part. So I think we can tick that off and now look at the production, at the packaging, at the distribution after the port of import until the consumer shelf. So if your other comment of just moving the cold storage to European Union or European countries, it's a good option, and it boils down to the logistical decisions that we make. We need to make better logistical decisions. Currently, how we make decisions is based on firefighting. We just want to get our food exported with all the challenges we have. And the second thing, we base it on cost. And now we add something more to our toolbox where we say, let's have a look at emissions. So we've got 3 things in our box which we are using now to hopefully influence our decision making in the entire process. So yeah, it's a very good comment, and I look forward to your email. Thank you. Prof. De Jager, Dr. De Jager.
Thank you, Martin. Every time I listen to you, I'm inspired all over again. Everybody has been saying it to you, but to repeat it, congratulations. This was wonderful work. This is really groundbreaking. If a fairy would land on my shoulder and give me one wish after this webinar, it would be that we can maintain our head start now on research and development. And I know the University of Stellenbosch alone cannot do it, and Van der Pan alone, and industry alone cannot do that. What we need is many more of this kind of discussions, and not only the talking part of it, but taking hands, forging partnerships between industry, value chain players, agribusiness, logistics, even the consumers should be involved in this. From a philosophical point of view, this is exactly why we need to have the producer closer to the consumer and vice versa. We must try to move and put in storage as little as possible in the food chain. In my home organization here in SAI, we are part of the board of Campagna Nica, an international network of local farmers markets. And we are pushing for it, not only to bring the producer and the consumer closer to each other, but also for all the other benefits of not needing to transport foodstuffs. Freshness is our hallmark. And we really try hard to see if we can get more consumers on our farms. Usually it only works the other way around. But of course, all of this boils down to what you have alluded to, the different ways of storage, the different ways of transportation. I'm actually flabbergasted by what you have shown us, the difference we could make if we have moved the fresh produce on rail rather than road. The difference between rail eventually and air freight. But a lot of this actually boils down to what we can do in the policy environment. We need the policy makers to understand the nuts and bolts of these. And in Van der Pan, we are playing in that space. It is all about trying to align policies between the various countries, our nodes, as we call it, in Africa. And can you imagine if the brand produced in Africa could, by implication, also entail the lightest possible footprint on climate, biodiversity, and nature? And I think it is important, colleagues, that we exchange email addresses and telephone numbers, and that we can see how we can save each other's school fees, how we can exchange research and also the technology part of it, and that we see how we can create opportunities to foster stronger partnerships. Thank you, Simba.
Thank you, Dr. Yagan. So I say a couple of other questions. I think some of them have somewhat been covered in a way, because one question from Busani was, how do you see the measurement of emissions from the fruit production value chain adding to the competitiveness of the South African fruit exports, given growing concerns on the food air miles? I think the last comment from Dr. Diega there, in a sense, is alluding to that. You know, can Africa have a low carbon footprint, product, and that becomes our marketing rally? So to some extent, but what I'm noticing here is that while Martin's research focused on the logistics portion of the value chain, Martin, you were asking about possible areas of further research. I think we've, a lot of these have come out of the questions, especially pre-logistics, like on the farm itself, the production systems, and of course, comments that look, sustainability is much more than just the carbon footprint. Yes, indeed, it's a big issue. But as the chairman said at the beginning, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we obviously need to see how we can continue to get data, more research on these various facets of the value chain. We still have a bit of time, but noting that for some people, at least in South Africa, this was lunchtime. We are so grateful that you've been able to, to stick with us. We can take maybe a few more questions, but before we do that, just for the record, I'm going to request that you, if you can, if bandwidth allows, if you can switch on your videos so we can take a group photo just for the record. Please, if you can indulge us. Kanto, are you on standby? Are you ready to do that? For those who are able to put their cameras on, your videos on, so that we can take that photo quickly. I know we're talking about a serious subject, but there's also the human side. Since we can't be in person and seeing each other, it's also nice to see who was here. Thank you.
All right, so everyone, if you can hold your smile for 3 seconds.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Kanto. So we do, I'm just trying to check if I didn't leave any question here on the chat. Says from Angela, the moving of fruit is also market price related, especially in the current environment in Europe with their energy cost crisis. The consumer will be less concerned about the carbon emissions of the fruit, but rather the pricing. We do need to understand the emissions for future competitiveness. And it says the price, market price will always dictate the storage time and mode of transport. There was also a question about the impact of load shedding, especially on storage. Would this actually make a difference to the power cuts? Will they make a difference to the carbon footprint? I don't know, Martin, can you hazard a guess as to what would happen here?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So first, in terms of the effect that load shedding has on refrigeration emissions, as with anything in life, economy of scale, the larger you do something, the more efficient it becomes. So supplying a storage facility which has 6,500 pallet spaces, the electricity for that from a generator, a 2000 kVA generator, instead of using grid electricity, has a significant impact on the emissions of this facility, because your generator is not nearly as efficient as Eskom's grid electricity. So per unit of electricity, to supply that or to substitute a unit of electricity from the grid with a generator has a significant impact. I did a journal article about that. You are more than welcome to just Google it, cold storage of fresh fruit. And the first journal article that pops up, you're welcome to have a look at that. It answers your question. And then the other comment with regards to the energy crisis in Europe, I do agree that that has a significant impact on the potential of shipping the fruit to Europe and cold store or using cold storage there. Until the time being where Europe resolves its energy crisis, we are going to continue to store the fruit for longer durations in South Africa. So whether we store it here or we store it there, we still need to assess the storage emissions. So yeah, that's a good comment about the energy crisis there. One other comment that I've also picked up quite a lot is the debate around the food miles, or they call it the food miles debate. And this entire debate is centered around that closer is better. So I have my point of consumption here, and I've got my point of production here. And the closer these two are to each other, the less emissions are emitted. And that's true to a certain extent, but not always, because what happens if I have to store that fruit for 6 months until consumption? Then the balance weighs out. Then it's better to import the fruit from a different hemisphere, 12,000 kilometers away, than it is to store the fruit for 6 months on end. So the framework that we develop really enables you to quantify almost both sides of the argument, where you say local produce that's sold locally and consumed locally, you can sort of calculate that. And then the other part where you have international fruit distribution across two different hemispheres, then you can calculate those emissions. And yeah, this debate originated in the 1990s by the Sustainable Alliance. But 30 years later, we still have questions about the methodology that they used. So yeah, hopefully my research can hopefully give them some sustenance to address this problem in a credible and accurate way. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Martin, and yeah, thank you very much to Martin and of course to David for the reflections. We also want to thank our chair, Dr. Diaga, for the further comments as well as the opening remarks. I think you'll agree with me that this was a very interesting subject matter, something which we have not in the past attended to. I know that when we're talking about climate change in a lot of our policy discussions, it's usually focusing on adaptation rather than emissions or mitigation. But we need to close that gap. And so, yeah, this was a rich presentation. I'm not going to try and summarize it, but for me, the interesting part was while you focus on logistics, but it's also the questions that came up looking at the entire value chain from farm to fork, and to try and see that there is a lot of questions that we still need answers to if we're going to have, to map the total sort of carbon footprint of, any industry, be it fruit or be it any other sort of agriculture, commodity. So there's a lot of room for collaboration, a lot of room for biological, colleagues, scientists to also come in at various points within this value chain to provide those answers. We have a lot of questions. So once again, Martin, thanks so much for this. And we look forward to, further research, and you're most welcome to come back and use our platform at FANAPAN to convene and share this information with a broader network of practitioners and players in the industry. So what's left for me is to ask my colleague, Thembi Mwamakamba, who is the Director of Policy Research at FANAPAN, to give us some closing remarks. Thembi, over to you.
Thank you, Simba. I think this has been a really exciting webinar. As you have mentioned, most often our emphasis or focus is on adaptation, but having a look at the other way things work, looking at mitigation and looking at what needs to be done within the African context, specifically looking at the South Africa food industry, has really been an eye-opener. I know that as we go to COP as Africa, what we want to see are sort of tangible and actionable climate decisions. And we want to probably see an advancement in as far as the implementation of the national determined contributions are concerned, specifically around the issues of adaptation and mitigation. We want to also see a delivery of finance to enhance implementation. But we are not going to get all that if we are just talking without evidence to back our arguments. And what Martin has done today by presenting his research is to actually give us that evidence that allows us to speak from a point of authority. And for that, we want to say thank you. I'd also like to thank also all the partners that have participated in today's webinar. A special thank you to our FunPan board chair, Dr. Theo Diaga, and also a special thanks to our colleagues who have, asked the difficult questions and have challenged Martin further to think more deeply about his study and what needs to be done further. I also want to thank David Farrell from Blue North for his interventions and for also placing Martin's study in the context of industry, of what's happening in as far as industry is concerned. And I'll also like to thank our colleagues at the National Agriculture Marketing Council for being part of the brains behind the convening of this webinar. I also want to close by thanking the University of Stellenbosch, of course, the Industrial Engineering Department where Martin is situated. And I would like to thank his supervisors and everybody that has supported him with his study. And just to invite you again in future when you receive invitations from FANAPAN to say this is a platform where we want to have an open and free dialogue and where we can come together, bring our minds together in coming up with solutions that will sort of better the lives of our population on the continent. So thank you very much, and thank you to you, Professor Simbasibanda, for the excellent facilitation and for tying everything together so nicely. I think from my end, that's all that I have to say. Thank you and have a good afternoon. And those that will be traveling to COP in the coming days, we will see you there. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Tembi, and thanks to everyone. So this brings us to the end of this very interesting webinar. So thank you, one and all. Goodbye.
Goodbye.